Hello and welcome to Cherry Becaert's webinar entitled Are You Ready for NIST 800-171 Compliance? My name is Neal Beggan and I'll be walking you through today's agenda. We're going to start and give a little bit of brief background on Cherry Bekaert as a whole, as well as our two speakers today, myself and Michael Townsend. We're then going to get into what is this NIST SP 800-171 that we're discussing today, who does it apply to. Anybody that's looked into it at all has seen plenty of acronyms, two of the most important being CUI and CDI, so we're going to decipher those a little bit. And then we're going to talk a little bit about what you as a government contractor can do to comply with these standards. So just a couple of housekeeping notes before we begin. Really appreciate everybody joining today. We actually have over 150 people registered for this webinar. Our intent is to answer as many questions live as we can. If you have questions, by all means, enter them into the question window there on your screen. And again, we will make every effort to answer them live. However, with the number of attendees today, it is quite possible that we will not be able to get to everyone. That does not mean do not ask your question. We will absolutely follow up with you after the webinar. In addition, this presentation will be available for download on our website. We absolutely encourage you to download and share, and we're here to help. So with that, let's get started. So a little bit about Cherry Bekaert. We've been in business for 70 years. We have over 1,100 associates firm-wide. We are a CPA and consulting firm based out of Richmond, Virginia, and we operate in 6 states, ranging from the Washington, D.C. region all the way down to Miami. We are ranked in the top 25 of accounting firms in the United States, and we are a proud founding member of Baker Tilly International Alliance. That is the 8th largest accountancy and business advisory network in the world. A little bit about myself. Again, my name is Neal Beggan. I'm a graduate of James Madison University, born and raised here in this great state of Virginia. I've been with Cherry Bekaert since 2008 and previously worked at both KPMG and Ernst & Young. My entire career has been devoted to the area of IT consulting and audit. In fact, when I started with KPMG, I was in their downtown Washington, D.C. office and did primarily federal government work. I wanted to be exposed to the commercial sector, so I left there. And much like what we're going to talk about today, the government keeps sucking me back in. So a lot of the NIST standards that we're talking about are designed for commercial companies today. And so it's come full circle for me. As the firm leader for our IT audit and risk assurance and advisory services practice. And really what we do, our motto is that we help organizations leverage their system of internal control to better manage risk, support growth, and promote sustainability. And really those 3 things that you see there in that statement are pretty evident in today's presentation, and we hope you feel the same. With me today, we've got Michael Townsend. I'm going to let Michael introduce himself. Michael, if you could.
Yeah, thanks, Neal. My name is Michael Townsend. I'm a senior manager in our firm's Tampa office. I born and raised in Tampa, Florida, and so kind of it's my bread and butter to stay in this area. But I am a graduate in the University of South Florida and the University of Tampa, and heavily focused in kind of the IT background. I started with Cherry Bekaert in 2013. But, prior to that, I was with PwC and EY. And my background is everything from internal audit, IT consulting, and also financial audit. And so really with the group that I'm working with right now and the services that we're providing, we're primarily focused on IT governance assessments and IT risk assessments. We're also looking at information security program implementations that our clients have in place, similar to the cybersecurity assessments. And also, big service that we have and have a lot of clients actually going through this nowadays is pre- and post-system implementation reviews or independent verification and validation services. So that's my background, Neal, and then up back to you.
Excellent. Appreciate it.
So enough about us. Let's talk about why we're here today. I'm sure many of you recognize some of the logos on the screen that have been high-profile victims of some of the large-scale breaches to occur over the last year or so. Truth is, it seems to be a daily occurrence at this point. You obviously, can't get on the internet, turn on the TV, open up the paper without reading about some sort of breach. While these are some of the more recognizable brands, the fact of the matter is that more than 50% of breaches occur at companies with less than 250 employees. So to think that you're too small to be a target, it's just not the correct stance to take in this day and age, no matter what industry you're in. And well, let's just say the government is taking notice of a lot of these breaches and ones that are occurring within their walls, and as a result of what we're going to discuss today, have made it very clear that they have not taken that stance, and they want to ensure that they do everything they can to protect their data. And if you think about it, the threats facing government's unclassified information, which many on this webinar have access to, have dramatically increased over the years as more services are provided online, as we digitally store data on behalf of or for the government, and as the government relies on the contractor industry for numerous IT services. So on the screen, obviously, you see some of these recent high-profile commercial incidents, but let's not forget those breaches dealing with governments themselves or their contractors. You know, you'd think that a few months ago, the May WannaCry attack would have opened everyone's eyes, but yet just yesterday, an even larger ransomware attack hit across the globe, which affected all types of industries, including governments and their contractors. And similar to the WannaCry attack, this one was successful due to vulnerabilities, again, in the Microsoft Windows environment. And these vulnerabilities were known because of a, wait for it, leak of hacking tools used by our own NSA. That could have and should have been alleviated with a simple patch. And it's because of the constant threat, like WannaCry and this most recent attack yesterday, involving government information, that the demand for security requirements are more clearly, effectively, and consistently communicated to both government and industry.
So as a result of a lot of these breaches and the frequency at which they are occurring, the government obviously took notice, and as a result, NIST SP, which stands for Special Publication 800-171, was developed. NIST stands for the National Institute of Standards and Technology, based right around the corner there in Maryland. And what this special publication is a set of security requirements. It's made up of 14 families that result in 109 individual controls that are applicable to the folks that we're talking to on the call today. And really the goal is to protect, and here's where these two acronyms, or two of the many acronyms rather, CUI and CDI, that being controlled unclassified information, and or covered defense information between the federal government and their contractors. We're going to dive in again a little bit later on in this presentation about what those two types of data sets mean and some examples of each. So as such, these requirements could be added or referenced in federal contracts and be a requirement to do business, where the CUI and CDI is stored, processed, or transmitted. And again, we're going to dig into that a little bit here in the next slide or two as well. But essentially, effective December 2016, NIST 800-171 is determined to be key to creating greater consistency across the government. So let's talk about a little bit about those 14 families that result in the 109 individual controls that are needed for compliance. Michael, if you could.
Yes, so when you're looking at NIST 800-171, as Neal mentioned, there's 14 security control families that we typically would look at. And they're all based on confidentiality of the information and not specifically on the integrity and availability of your information. So when we're talking about the access controls, this is going to be your typical user provisioning process and your SOD process that you have within your organization. And it's really the organization's focus on the organization's need to limit information system access to only authorized users. And then when we're looking over at the next one here for security awareness training, that's based on the organization's need to ensure that its managers, its users, administrators are all aware of the security risk associated with their activities and also the applicable laws that might apply to them. So it's going to be the policies, the standards, the instructions, any regulations and other procedures that might apply to the security of their information systems. And these organizations also want to ensure that their personnel are adequately trained in order to carry out their assigned roles. So it's not just making sure that you're taking security awareness training, it's also, do your administrators have the technical knowledge that they need to be able to execute their jobs, and can you support that with evidence of that training? Next thing I look here is audit and accountability objectives, which is based on the organization's need to create, protect, and retain information system. And the system's audit records really is what's important here, that you can go through and at a later date monitor, analyze, investigate, and if needed, report on any unlawful use of the systems or any unauthorized or inappropriate use of any kind of information security activity. Configuration management is based on an organization's need to establish and maintain baseline configurations for all their hardware, be it firewalls, servers, routers, or even applications themselves. And it also covers having an inventory of all those systems, including the hardware, software, firmware, and documentation that these systems have gone through a system development lifecycle. So if we're kind of looking at examples here, we're going to be talking about the firewall rule sets that you might also have in place and have maintained, and evidence that they've gone through a change management process, and then also making sure that your baseline configurations can be pulled up at any time in the case of you have a system going down, that you can easily bring those things back up. Next thing to look at here is the identification authorization family. And with that, that's based on the organization's need to identify information system users, the processing acting on behalf of the users, and or devices for authenticating the identities of those users. So this is going to be the multi-factor authentication requirement that some companies might have. So your 10 and 2 that you might have in place, or establishing high-level application or operating system password settings, or even lockout procedures. So that's really what's going to be important in this area. In terms of
Michael?
the yes, sir.
Michael, we got one question coming in. Sorry to interrupt, but just before we get too far along, you mentioned SOD when talking about access control, and one of the questions that just came through is, what do you mean by SOD?
It's going to be the segregation of duties controls. So that's really going to be over your process, business process, making sure that certain fraud risks are being taken care of, and that duties are separated so that you can limit those fraud risks. And this is going to take place really at operational level, but also can be implemented at the system level.
Great, thanks.
No problem. And so the next area that we're covering is the incident response. And the reason the incident response is important here is because it's based on the organization's need to establish handling procedures for the organization's systems that make sure that the systems are adequately protected, or actually there's adequate preparation, detection, analysis, containment, recovery, and appropriate response to any potential activities that might happen with the system. So this is going to be, how will the organization respond in case of a malware attack, or in case an attacker breaks into your system and is getting access to classified information. What's the approach management and IT need to take in order to address this incident? And really what they need to do is they make sure they're appropriately tracking, documenting, and reporting the incident to appropriate organizational officials, and then they have those controls in place really for making sure that they're handling everything correctly. And that process really needs to be tested as well. So it's not just having a plan in place, it's also testing that plan to make sure it works appropriately.
And Michael, just so we're talking apples, you mentioned classified, but obviously the focus of today being unclassified, that would be for 800-171 purposes, would include unclassified information too. Is that correct?
Yes, it is. Okay, and so the next phase we'll be covering here is maintenance. And the maintenance objective is based on the organization's need to periodically and timely provide periodic and timely maintenance of the organization's systems, and to have the appropriate tools and techniques in place to conduct that system maintenance. And beyond that, it's making sure that, going back to the awareness and training objective, that your people have the correct knowledge as to how to appropriately update those systems. And it's not just going to be your network that we're talking about doing regular system updates to your servers. It's also looking at any of the applications that you're utilizing within your system to make sure that we've updated provided any security updates to the users that had the systems updated as needed throughout the year. Next area that we're covering here is media protection. Media protection is important because it's about protecting the information system's media, be it paper or digital, and limiting access to that information to only authorized users within the organization. And then, if needed, sanitizing or destroying that information prior to release or disposal. And so this is going to apply just this organization in general, but also thinking of top executives and the information that they have on their personal machines, and also in their personal file shares that they may use on the network, making sure that information that only executives have access to is restricted to those individuals. Next area is personal security. And when we're here, we want to ensure that individuals occupying positions of responsibility within the organization are really trustworthy and meet the established security criteria for their positions. So have they had the background checks? Have they gone through the acceptable use policy for the organization? Do we make sure they write the right people, and do they understand really what the risks are to the organization, and are they abiding by those? And to make sure that upon termination of any individual within an organization, are we reacquiring the keys or access cards that they may have? Are they returning their computers? And do we have controls in place to make sure we've collected all this information, and are we really abiding by any of the security policies and procedures that are in place to make sure that before they walk out the door, we're completely covered. Next area we're covering here is physical protection, and this is based on the organization's need to limit physical access to the information systems, equipment, and even the operating environment to only authorized users. So we're basically protecting our data centers and our work environments to make sure that people that shouldn't be within those areas aren't obtaining access, and then also making sure that that the utilities and other systems that are protecting those systems, such as your data center, making sure that your generators are appropriately being tested, making sure your backup devices are being tested, and making sure that really you can turn the lights on in case of an emergency. So really that's kind of the focus here, and making sure that we protect our data, and we can make sure that we can bring it up, the data, in case of emergency. Next area, for number 11, is going to be our risk assessment process, and just making sure that we're periodically assessing risk for the organization, and really focusing on the mission, the functions, the image and the reputation of the firm, and what the potential impact could be to our organizational assets, our individuals, and even the information systems that we have. So we're looking at the processing and storage and transmission of information, storage, and transmission of the information, and what's the potential risk to the organization if those controls are in place, or the controls aren't in place. Next area is going to be our security assessments. This is going to be any annual security self-awareness training that we're performing, or what's your self-assessment process that you go through to assess your risk. And the next thing is also implementing any kind of continuing monitoring controls that might be in place. So this is periodically assessing the security controls in the organization's information systems to determine if the controls are effective and applicable, and then developing and implementing plans of action to correct any deficiencies and eliminate vulnerabilities in the process. So next one we have here for number 13 is our systems and communications protection. And this is based on the organization's need to monitor, control, protect, and organize the communication systems. And we're looking at the external boundaries, external and internal boundaries of our information systems. So it's not just what we're doing inside, but also kind of looking at those ways to protect people from getting into our systems, and also employing architectures and software tools in order to restrict access to these systems and promote effective information security for the organization as a whole. So focus here is effective firewall rule sets being put into place, having appropriate monitoring controls over top of the activity that we're seeing on the firewall, and then also monitoring access to any remote connections as it may be to our system to make sure that the appropriate people from outside our organization are accessing our network. And then our last one is security and information integrity. And for this, we just want to make sure we're identifying, reporting, and correcting any information security flaws in a timely manner. Basically about providing protection against malicious code that might enter with the organization, and then monitoring any system alerts and making sure we're taking appropriate actions in case something does come up in terms of, again, malware or anything else along those lines. And our way to make sure that we're correctly going through this process is, be it quarterly or annual, based on the sensitivity of the systems that we're utilizing, making sure that we're performing vulnerability assessments, and even pen testing as needed. And really for that even penetration testing, if you're implementing a new system and it's external facing, consider the risk to the organization. Every time you implement a system, you might actually want to do pen testing prior to the go live of that actual system.
So Michael, the question box is definitely working, and there's several questions based on the fact that you just had a mouthful. I'll take the first one and then hand the second one over to you. The first one asked, how is this different than 853? Great question. For those that aren't aware of 853, we will get into it a little bit more in the presentation. But to answer the question here, 853, again, another publication put out by NIST, is really much more extensive. But really the intent of 853 was that it was designed for federal systems, whereas 171, the focus of today's presentation, is for non-federal systems that obviously are being maintained and or administered by the folks on today's webinar. Many compliance areas are based on 53. You have FedRAMP, FISMA, whether or not organizations need to receive what's called an ATO, an authorization to operate a system on behalf or for the federal government. As a result of those compliance areas, 853 requires a third-party assessment, whereas 171 does not. The extent of 53 is really dependent on system classification, and there's three of those. There's low, moderate, and high, and depending on where you fall on that spectrum, can really result in hundreds of controls that need to be implemented. But again, it varies by the system and or the environment. Whereas 171, they've determined, and I think we have it on another slide here shortly, that all systems will be considered moderate, and as a result, we'll have to comply with the same 109 controls. In essence, 171 is considered to be 53 light, if you will. So, Michael, one of the other questions, now that you've had a chance to catch your breath, that came across was, so you have these 14 control families here. What have you seen with other government contractors in terms of, say you had to pick one or two that have been the hardest to comply with, maybe that maturity in that area was not where it needed to be? If you had to pick one or two, what would those be for government contractors?
Well, I would have to say probably security awareness and training, and also the risk assessment process are really the two that I see that have the most difficulty. And when looking at the awareness and training, from the awareness and training perspective, usually difficulty to have there is the technology environment is consistently and will always be changing, and making sure that your trainings are updated to reflect the changes in the risk that we're facing in our environment is very difficult. And you usually look at trainings only occurring once per year. Well, in actuality, you could go through and monthly provide updates to your users as to what the risks are to the environment, to your information system environment. And the other is, really administrators making sure that they're being appropriately trained in their job and responsibilities. How often are we limiting the resources to our IT and departments in terms of budget? Well, it's hard enough for them to do their job already, but they also need the appropriate training in order to address any of the risk that the organization is facing. And so there's that cost associated with it. And then also, it's really from the user perspective, how often are we kind of blasting them with emails, worrying about information security and the risk and everything else? So if we continually provide regular training, like I mentioned before, if it was on a monthly basis, that would be information overload for these users. But if you kind of look back, you're only providing security awareness training once per year, and as you're going through that, those people might not be paying attention during the training sessions, and they might not be getting all the relevant information that they need. So there's just the risk overall to them. The next one was just what I mentioned, risk assessment process, and for that one, the difficulty is really finding the correct resources to complete your risk assessment process. So do they understand how to perform a risk assessment? Do they understand the potential risk of the overall organization? So they're properly versed of the organization's risk, and do they have appropriate experience that goes along with that? And then once if they have identified all the risk, it's getting the buy-off from management to really go through and to implement the necessary controls to mitigate any of the risk that they might have encountered.
yeah, I'll just piggyback on kind of two points there with awareness and training. Again, when we're talking purely cybersecurity risk and the risk of being breached, it's widely known that I think over 50% is the stat that breaches occur as a result of human error. So whereas a lot of people think, I just need to invest in software and hardware, whether it be firewalls or endpoint protection or actual components themselves, really the first line of defense most oftentimes is your people. So increasing your awareness training is paramount. The second thing I would piggyback, not necessarily for one specific area out of the 14, but what we find when we go into organizations, and this is not solely based on government contracts, it's really industry agnostic, if you will, is really a lack of documentation, policy and procedures and otherwise. Obviously, dealing with federal standards means some pretty rigorous policy and procedure documentation we'll get into here shortly. And let's be honest, IT folks aren't known for their desire or really their writing capability in terms of documenting policy and procedures. So moving forward, and I know that was a lot to take in, but we did want to cover at least a little bit about each of those 14 areas because, again, they apply to all contractors that are required to comply with 800-171. Let's talk about a little bit about who does this actually apply to. And I know there's folks on the phone that are probably most interested in this question. So there's kind of two answers. Currently, only DoD contractors and their subcontractors, and I want to come back to that and make sure we hammer on that for a second, but only DoD contractors and their subcontractors, this is a flow down clause, are required to assess their compliance and complete any compliance gaps by December 31st of this year. However, what we have seen recently, more than any, is that other contracts, and some of these are non-DoD contracts, require the protection of CUI, which really brings 800-171 into play. Regardless of current contracts, it is widely believed, and we'll probably say this on more than one occasion or more than one slide, if you will, that a general FAR rule, not a DFARS rule, a FAR rule, will require cyber protection of CUI in all contracts and agreements. And that rule is expected to be final in 2017. And so we have the quote here that is the stated intent by the U.S. federal government that all FARS contracts will include the requirement to be compliant with NIST 800-171 over the next few years. So for those folks that are on the call that maybe are looking at the right side of the screen more than the left, I would strongly suggest that you not put this on the back burner and wait for it to come around. In fact, quite the opposite. Companies that are getting out in front of these compliance measures are finding them a lot easier to deal with. The other thing that we've seen, two points I wanted to make, oftentimes we've seen contracting officers asking for a status. So one of the questions, and I can see coming across here is, well, I've got a DoD contract, but I don't think it has the DFARS contract, or the DFARS clause. Well, obviously check into that. If you have a contract that maybe has been going on for a few years before this went into effect, it is the responsibility of the DoD to do a contract mod. And if they do, then you obviously need to be compliant, but obviously you can reach out to your contracting officer in any of those cases. The other thing I'll point out, though, again, with the subcontractor statement that we've got, bolded and underlined there on purpose, if you are a prime, you should be asking your subs. If you're a prime that has this contract requirement, you should be asking the subs about where they stand with compliance. And those are kind of two things that we're seeing. So, continuing that, if you're a contractor providing services to the federal government, your organization is responsible for protecting CUI, which is controlled unclassified information that we're going to get into here in just a second. We've got the DFARS clause listed here that require you to implement safeguards over these by December 31st. An important note that we have here at the bottom is prior to this deadline of December 31st, DoD contractors must report any 800-171 requirements not implemented, so gaps, within 30 days of contract award. Typically, when we talk about reporting, it's typically a letter to the DoD CIO with a status and a plan to deal with gaps, and that normally will suffice, but we did want to point that out. So we've talked about, and you've seen CUI and CDI. Let's talk a little bit about what those two are. Michael, if you could, we're going to jump into controlled unclassified information.
Okay, so CUI, or controlled unclassified information, is any information that must be safeguarded or requires dissemination controls pursuant to and consistent with applicable laws, regulations, and government-wide policies. And this is really what's required by the National Archives and Records Administration, or NARA. And it's any information that has been collected, developed, received, transmitted, used, or stored by or on behalf of a contractor in support of or performance of a contract. And it's estimated that over 300,000 contractors or grantees hold the CUI data. And so this is going to be your government contractors from the federal level, the state and local governments and their contractors. You're going to have your colleges and universities that may have this data, and as well as any of the non-for-profit organizations and some foreign governments.
Yeah, Michael, and we've kind of summarized there on the right. It's essentially unclassified information that is to be protected from public disclosure. So let's talk about what some types of CUI are.
So some of the types of CUI that you might see out there is really going to, first off, and kind of most notable is just the controlled technical information, and I'll go into that in more detail in just a second. But just starting there is controlled technical information, any kind of emergency management information that might be available. Always we want to keep financial data, basically try to keep that information close to our vest. Information security, vulnerability information. So if you're going through and performing a vulnerability assessment or pen test of your systems, you want to make sure that's protected for eyes-only individuals. You're also going to talk about any sort of law enforcement details. You always want to make sure any information from the law enforcement agencies are always kept aside. That's always nuclear information, and PHI or PII data is always going to be very important for us to look at and to protect that information. And location for all these items for CUI, and look at where we can find it all, is you can go on the CUI registry list, and it's going to have a list of all the information that is going to apply. And then you will go into detail of the controlled technical information, which I'm going to talk about here in just a second, of the types of information that fall under that category as well.
And again, just to reiterate, and I think I mentioned this earlier, so 853, you can have different types of system classifications, low, moderate, and high. Again, 800-171, on the other hand, it treats all CUI as having moderate impact under FIPS 199. Again, for those downloading the presentation afterwards, we've included the CUI registry list as a hyperlink, so you can go out there and see these types in a little bit more detail. Obviously, we don't have time today to walk through each one, but you see how kind of pervasive they are overall. And then Michael's going to talk about CDI, which really falls underneath this bolded area, which is controlled technical information.
And so the CDI, again, the controlled defense information, is really any unclassified controlled technical information or information described also in the CUI registry we just talked about that requires, something we talked about before, safeguarding or dissemination controls to be in place pursuant to laws and regulations. And this is all going to be marked or otherwise identified in the contracts. And so it's a must-have item being marked and identified in the contracts, task orders, or delivery orders, and provided to the contractor by or on behalf of the DoD in support of the performance of these contracts. And so we want to make sure that the information is collected, developed, received, transmitted, used, or stored by or on behalf of the contractor in support of the performance of the contract. So it's going to apply to any of the information that you're going to be utilizing from the second you obtain it to the second that you dispose of it. And so from some examples of these items is the types of CDI that I have here. This is really the technical information. So this technical information, it can be in the form of either technical data or actual computer systems. And the examples are going to include your research, search and engineering data or drawings, You're going to have any specific specifications, system specifications that might be in place, or standards that might be also that you have. Also focused on any manuals or technical reports that your organization could be utilizing, any specific data sets or studies that you may have performed. And it's also really focused on here is making sure that, from again, an IT technical standpoint, is that your computer software and executable code and source code access is restricted to that data to only those who require access to it. So even your coders that might be developing software in a specific application, they should not have access to that other than the development purposes. And then once that good information goes live, they should have access restricted to that data, and then nobody outside the organization should have access to that code.
And it's interesting because a lot of people will obviously focus in on code and source code, as well as data sets and so forth. But if you start looking into, and again, this is all on the CUI registry, what some of this information means, it really can just be documentation that needs to be protected. And I think it's important to note here that it's not just information given by the government. So, for example, if you were to produce a part, a widget, something that was part of a mechanical device used by the DoD as a result of a DoD contract, that whole build sheet and whatever you do to execute the contract, that's considered CDI. So again, there's a little bit of confusion when we're talking to folks about what really falls into that category. And if you have questions, I know we're not able to dive too deep in any of these areas in the result of a 50-minute webinar. By all means, reach out, or as we mentioned, we've included the CUI registry hyperlink. Feel free to check into that as well. So you've heard a little bit about what NIST 800-171 is, how it plays in with CDI and CUI as a result of DFARS and future FARS contracts. And so, what does this mean to you? Well, quite frankly, if you've got experience with prior government compliance, namely NIST 853-based compliance areas, I mentioned some of these earlier, whether it's FSMA or FedRAMP, or if you received an authority to operate, chances are you're going to have little to no impact. And the caveat here is that assuming the same domain, meaning what you were compliant with earlier with 853, if it's the same domain that applies to your 800-171 CUI and CDI, chances are you're going to have little to no impact. Not going to be a heavy lift at all for your organizations, because again, 800-171 is widely considered to be 853 light. If you're kind of in the middle, so not necessarily heavy into government compliance areas, but have undergone other information security based compliance areas, or even financial reporting such as Sarbanes-Oxley, that does have an IT component and protection of data. Again, assuming the same domain would apply to your 1-800-171 environment, as long as you've been through, whether it's, again, ISO, PCI, any of the SOC, namely SOC 2 with security, if you're dealing with health data and gone through any HIPAA high trust type of compliance areas, we consider it a little bit more minimal impact, again, assuming the same domain. Usually it's more of a documentation exercise. As I mentioned earlier, that usually is a pretty big gap between what the government expects to see in the documentation arena versus normal commercial contracts. However, if all your controls are in place and implemented properly for a number of these types of compliance areas, chances are they're going to overlap significantly with the 109 controls in 171. Now, I will not say in totality, but again, depending on how many of these compliance areas you may have needed to meet with previously, increases the chances that it'll be a little easier for you to take on 171. The last category, however, though, is if you've got no prior compliance requirements, you're not publicly traded, you haven't had a need, you don't accept credit card data yet, you haven't had a need to undergo a PCI review, nobody's asked you for an ISO certification, you haven't had an independent SOC audit conducted by a CPA firm. This is where we see, organizations, again, that are going to have the biggest challenge, and it's not something that's insurmountable by any means, but it is something that we're encouraging our clients to get out in front of as early as possible. And the biggest thing is this development and or change in policies and procedures that I've talked about several times, actually implementing formal policy and procedures, associated forms, templates, and so forth. Can be a time-consuming process, as well as obviously implementing actual controls that these policies and procedures describe. And for some, again, depending on the maturity of your environment, it could actually mean incurring capital expenditures, whether it's replacing or upgrading hardware, software, actual applications, email systems, so forth. And the bright side of that is where it may cost more money than was anticipated to comply. Oftentimes, you can leverage systems that are, in essence, already compliant with 800-171 and really take advantage of those types of arrangements. So again, contractors with systems that already satisfy SB 853, in essence, you should exceed 800-171, assuming the same domains. If not, obviously you need to go through the exercise for the domain pertinent to 171. So the takeaway here is really to get started as early as possible. If you fall into one of the last two buckets, don't wait till the 11th hour. Obviously, some contracts and a lot more money is typically in place in terms of your ability to work with the federal government and or prime contractors that are utilizing your services under some of these contracts that we've talked about. So we want to leave you with, what can you do to comply? Easiest thing kind of to start off with is review your current or even your future, your pipeline contract requirements. Again, just because you have a contract now with the federal government or a prime contractor supporting a federal government contract that does not necessarily have the DFARS clause explicitly pointed out or requirement of the protection of CUI does not mean that it won't, again, even maybe before the end of the year when the new FAR requirement comes out. But, again, going back to one of our previous slides, the expectation is that any contract that requires the protection of CUI or CDI will require compliance with 800-171 within the next couple of years. So looking at those current contract requirements, again, reaching out to your contracting officer if it makes sense, reaching out to your prime contractor if you're a sub, or the opposite. If you're a prime, reaching out to a subcontractor, get out in front of it, see what they're doing, make sure that they're aware of what's coming up around the corner, whether it's this year or coming up next year and beyond. Obviously, performing a gap assessment is smart with any compliance area. You can utilize the NIST 800-171 publication as guidance. It's obviously fairly lengthy. As I mentioned, 14 control families with 109 controls as a result. And so really performing the actual assessment and doing the actual gap analysis. And then as a result, formalizing that with a gap analysis report that compares your current controls against the 800-171 moderate control level requirement. So having something formal that shows that you've done your analysis and you know where the gaps are. And then taking that a step further and developing the standard documentation. For those that have operated in the federal space, they'll recognize the term SSP for System Security Plan. I can tell you, as a result of developing many of these over the years, these are not, a 1 or 2 day exercise and, a couple page document that you slap your logo on and you're done. They're very extensive control documentation, policy and procedures. And the second one, again, that those familiar will understand POAM, those not, stands for Plan of Action and Milestones. So again, once your gaps have been identified, having a plan to remediate those gaps where necessary and being able to communicate it, kind of speaking the same language, if you will, the POAM language, back and forth with your federal customers is very important. And as part of that POAM, it's really coming up with that roadmap for any remediation efforts, but also continuous monitoring. Much like any other compliance area, this is not a set it and forget it type of exercise. This is something that is not going away. In fact, it will probably become, as I mentioned earlier, more pervasive a year from now than it is today on these federal contracts. So setting up continuous monitoring to be able to demonstrate, again, whether it's to a prime contractor and or the federal government, your clients, how you are not only in compliance, but maintaining compliance over the course of the contract will be very important. So we are at about the end of the time, although I see one question that I did want to answer that relates kind of to what we're talking about here on this slide, is whether or not a certification is necessary. And I think that the question is probably around the SCNA certification that many of you may have been hearing about. The answer, short answer, no. There's no certification requirement as of right now for 800-171. Obviously, staying on top of things and up on guidance and seeing if that changes over the next year or two, seeing what results from the new FAR clause expected out later in this year. But as of right now, there's no certification requirement. In fact, there's no real third-party independent assessment. However, we'd be lying if we didn't say, we highly suggest a formal assessment report. I used the analogy the other day with a prospect that, I work for a CPA firm. I'm fully capable of doing my own taxes. I'm fully capable of going on TurboTax and spitting out the necessary forms for federal and state. God forbid I get audited and I'm pointing, to my TurboTax. And as a result of that, I get my taxes done by a qualified CPA who gives me, a nice bound copy every year. So again, God forbid I get audited, I'm able to show them the due diligence that I did in having a CPA perform the work and it being on the up and up. We would say the same thing with 800-171. Again, no requirement for a third-party assessment. However, you have to take into consideration the burden on internal resources, as well as, for many folks, I'm sure on the call, lack of overall knowledge of some of these federal compliance areas. So hiring a third party to come in and really run you from left to right on this screen in terms of what you need to do to comply, quite frankly, can actually save you money oftentimes. Not always, I'll be honest, depending on how familiar you are with these types of compliance areas, but oftentimes can be a money saver in terms of getting somebody in to just do it right and do it right the first time, much like the CPA example that I mentioned. The other thing is, you can, as a result of getting a third party in, you can get an actual assessment report. So the deliverables of these type of engagements will not only include, the gap analysis, the resulting documentation, the SSP, the POAM, and so forth, but an actual assessment report. And those are fantastic, whether or not, again, God forbid you're audited, or whether or not your prime contractor is asking a sub and you're a sub, being able to show them that, or the federal government, having an assessment report is great. And not only that, excuse me, they can become competitive tools. And so, Patrick, I'm going to pause here. Excuse me. Take a sip of water. Starting off on not only that, they can become competitive tools. And not only that, quite frankly, they can become competitive tools when going after an RP or being a target for a prime contractor that's looking to team with subcontractors to go after a federal engagement. Oftentimes having formal documentation that you're able to demonstrate that you're fully prepared and compliant in this area can be a differentiator.
So Neal, we had another question come up. How long does it take for this assessment process to how long does it typically take to complete?
Great question. Another great question. Unfortunately, a little harder to answer. A lot depends on the complexity of your specific environment that is subject to 171. And again, part of the initial steps that we would take as a firm is to help define the actual system boundary, what is in scope, what contract or contracts does this apply to, and what does it mean to you. And that does vary pretty considerably across the board when you start dealing with government contractors. However, I can tell you from experience that typically if I had to do an average range from kind of procurement to completion for most government contractors that we've been dealing with, it's typically about 30 to 60 days. So we've talked a lot. We tried to answer several questions real time while still kind of confined to the 50 minutes that we had here. I do see plenty of questions that have come across. Again, to reiterate, we will follow up individually with anybody that submitted questions. My contact information as well as Michael's is here on the screen, as well as will be available on the downloadable copy of this presentation on our website. Highly encourage you guys to reach out, even if it's with questions as you navigate through this process. You know, Cherry Bekaert, we pride ourselves on our work in the government contract community. We've begun helping several of our clients out with this, and are talking to many prospects that are in the same boat as you. It's okay to have questions, and by all means send them our way. If we can help, we're happy to. And again, we'd like to thank you for attending today's webinar on Are You Ready for 800-171 Compliance? My name is Neal Beggan. We appreciate your attendance today. Don't hesitate to reach out if you need anything else. Thanks so much and have a good one.